Welcome to Brushstrokes of Being. This episode has been on my mind for a long time. Art as brand. Art marketing courses that talk about brands and the market. Today, I want you to imagine a small scene. Imagine the gallery director leaving through the portfolio. The work is beautiful, they might say. But what is the concept? What is the social angle? What makes it contemporary? How will collectors recognize it instantly? None of these questions are unreasonable. Yet, notice what has happened. The discussion has already moved away from the painting itself. The artist is no longer being evaluated primarily on what they have seen. They are being evaluated on how easily they can be positioned. And here is the strange possibility. That painter might very well be rejected. Not because the work lacks skill, but because it lacks something else. Branding, novelty, immediate recognizability. In fact, there is a curious thought experiment we can make. Artists like Diego Velázquez, Rembrandt van Rijn, or John Singer Sargent might struggle to enter today's art world. Not because they lacked innovation, but because they were too deeply concerned with observation. The language around artists today increasingly comes from marketing. We hear about personal brand, product consistency, recognizable style, niche positioning. An artist is encouraged to become a recognizable product. Collectors are told, buy what you recognize. And this produces a quiet but profound shift. Artists learn that repeating themselves is safer than evolving. Predictability sells. Risk becomes dangerous. That becomes inconvenient. Slowly, without anyone fully intending it, the system begins to reward the opposite of what historically made painting powerful. The ability to discover something new through seeing. Within representational painting circles, conversations often revolve around technical admiration. You hear phrases like beautiful brushwork, amazing edge control, so Sargent-like. And skill is indeed admirable, but skill alone is not vision. Technique is a language, and language does not automatically produce thought. The irony is that the painters most often referenced, artists like John Singer Sargent, were not admired in their time simply for their brushstrokes. They were admired because their paintings understood people. The brushwork was only the vehicle, not the destination. Another modern phenomenon is what we might call photo-replication painting. Many paintings today begin with projected photographs or detailed tracing. The artist carefully fills color within predetermined lines. The result can be impressive, but the process is fundamentally different from observation. Painters like Diego Velázquez and John Singer Sargent did not copy images. They were reconstructing perception. Every brushstroke involved decision-making. Where does the eye move? What matters most? What does this person feel like encountering? Observation is not mechanical replication. Observation is interpretive intelligence. Now consider Leonardo da Vinci. Today, he is often remembered as a painter of a handful of masterpieces. Yet painting occupied only a small part of his life's work. Leonardo filled thousands of notebook pages with observations. He studied anatomy by dissecting human bodies. He analyzed the movement of water. He examined the structure of plants, the formation of clouds, the flight of birds, the mechanics of facial expression, and the behavior of light. At first glance, these interests seem unrelated, but they were all expressions of the same discipline, learning how to see. Leonardo did not separate art from science or observation from understanding. For him, observation was the path toward knowledge itself. The same eye that painted the Mona Lisa studied muscles beneath the skin. The same eye that observed a smile examined the flow of rivers. The same eye that painted human presence sought to understand how reality reveals itself through careful attention. What made Leonardo extraordinary was not simply talent. It was the quality of his attention. He looked longer, he looked deeper. He resisted the temptation to replace observation with assumption. In many ways, this is what distinguished the great observational traditions of painting. Their goal was never merely to reproduce appearances. Their goal was to understand them. This is why observation cannot be reduced to realism. A camera records appearances. Observation seeks relationships. Observation asks, what matters? What is essential? What is alive in front of me? The old masters were not copying reality, they were investigating it. And perhaps that is precisely what makes observation increasingly difficult in a culture dominated by speed. The faster information arrives, the less time we spend looking. The less time we spend looking, the more easily assumptions replace perception. And when assumptions replace perception, both art and understanding begin to suffer. Another trap is style imitation. Painters are described as the new Sargent, the modern Velázquez, the contemporary Caravaggio. At first glance, this sounds flattering, but it quietly empties the work of independence. The painter becomes a historical echo rather than a living voice. The old masters studied deeply, but they did not copy the appearance. They absorbed structure. They absorbed perception, and then they transformed it. There is another cultural shift worth mentioning. Much contemporary art now functions as a personal diary. Private pain becomes the central subject. Trauma, confession, personal wounds placed directly on the canvas. This can be sincere, but sincerity alone does not create art. Pain becomes art only when it passes through transformation. Artists like Rembrandt van Rijn painted profound suffering, but they did not simply display pain. They transformed it into understanding. Today, however, pain is often presented without transformation. Emotion becomes spectacle, and spectacle is easy to sell. Narrative becomes the artwork. Observation, however, is harder to market. Observation requires time and silence. Another shift lies in the education of art historians and curators. Interpretation and observation are not the same skill. A person can be highly trained in theory and still struggle to analyze visual relationships directly from observation. Likewise, a painter may perceive relationships in a painting that they cannot easily express in academic language. Ideally, both forms of knowledge should inform one another. Yet increasingly, the interpretive side dominates. When institutions prioritize concept, narrative, and branding, something predictable happens. Artists trained in observation move to the cultural periphery, not because their work lacks depth, but because their work demands something rare: attention. Observation-based art does not shout. It unfolds slowly. But historically, it is precisely this kind of art that endures. Why would this even matter for society? Well, for centuries, art functioned as one of the humanity's great schools of observation. Learning to draw was never simply about learning to make pictures. It was training in attention. The artist learned to notice relationships that others overlooked. Light, structure, expression, gesture, contradiction. The practice cultivated patience, discrimination, and sensitivity to nuance. In this sense, observational training teaches far more than artistic skill. It teaches us how to look before we judge. And that may be one of the most valuable capacities a society can possess. This shift affects more than art. Observation is a form of intelligence. Through observation, we learn to perceive subtle emotion, complexity, contradiction, nuance. And when a culture loses its training in observation, the world becomes easier to simplify. Nuance disappears, surface impressions dominate, and societies that stop observing carefully become easier to manipulate. For centuries, art helped train the eye. It taught people how to see. We often assume that seeing is something that simply happens. Yet, anyone who has trained seriously in music, painting, medicine, craftsmanship, or science knows otherwise. Perception can be educated. The experienced eye notices relationships that remain invisible to the beginner. What appears to be talent is often the result of years of refined attention. The problem today may not be that great artists cannot exist. The problem may be that our systems reward visibility over depth, brand over presence, recognition over perception. Yet the quiet power of observation has never disappeared. Whenever an artist truly sees, something remarkable happens. The painting begins to breathe. And sometimes, if the observation is deep enough, the painting begins to look back. The history of great art is, in part, the history of people who trained themselves to observe reality more deeply than their contemporaries. Perhaps that is what art has always offered us at its best. Not escape from reality, not self-expression alone, but an invitation to pay closer attention, to look longer, to see more clearly, and in doing so, to encounter a world that is richer, more complex, and more alive than we first imagined.